Donald Trump signed an executive order this week accusing the pharmaceutical industry of overcharging Americans for prescription drugs. The fact sheet on the White House website describes the issue as another example of other countries freeloading off Americans who pay up, covering the cost of R&D and testing, while everyone else benefits from lower drug prices. The order doesn't describe how the US government plans on forcing companies to lower their prices, other than to threaten additional aggressive action. The order calls on the Health Department, led by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to communicate price targets to pharmaceutical companies, which has worried a few analysts that Trump plans to impose price controls on medications, tying the price that Americans pay to the lowest prices paid in comparably developed countries. There is a 4,000-year history of well-meaning governments imposing price controls, but no successful examples, as market prices are needed to solve the economic problem of how to most effectively allocate scarce resources in a world of unlimited wants and needs. The order directs RFK Jr. to establish a mechanism through which Americans can buy medicines directly from pharmaceutical companies, bypassing middlemen. This sent shares of Cigna, one of the largest health insurers in the United States, down almost 6%, and the drugstore giant CVS Health down more than 3%, as both own pharmacy benefit managers known as PBMs, which are companies that work with health insurers, large employers, and other payers to manage their prescription drug benefits. Most of the stock prices that declined bounced back later in the week, as investors appear to have decided that Trump is all bark and no bite. But it's still worth digging into why drug prices are so high in America. PBMs have been hit with criticism from antitrust regulators, lawmakers, independent pharmacies, and patient advocates in recent years for business practices that detractors say drive up drug costs for Americans. The pharmaceutical industry is America's most hated industry. According to a Gallup poll, only 20% of Americans view the industry positively, meaning that it's ranked below the federal government, lawyers, real estate agents, and even Mark Zuckerberg. Okay, they didn't actually put Mark Zuckerberg on the list. I made that bit up. But then I wondered who the most hated man in America actually is. So I Googled it, and it's Martin Shkreli, the Pharma guy who became famous a few years ago for hiking the price of an AIDS medicine. So I guess I was wrong. Americans actually love Mark Zuckerberg. Apparently he's the person Americans would most like to go for a coffee with.
You drink coffee, man, or no?
Nah.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, you've had it.
I have. Sometimes on vacation, I'll drink it recreationally. It's like every once in a while.
Americans have long complained about high prescription drug prices, and people from other countries are often amazed by how expensive healthcare is in the United States. Research from last year shows that prescription drugs cost almost 3 times as much in America as in the rest of the world. But of course, nothing's ever as simple as it first appears. The gap is largest for brand-name drugs, which cost 4.22 times as much in the United States as they cost in the rest of the world, but then unbranded generic drugs, which account for 90% of prescription drug volumes, are actually cheaper in the United States than elsewhere. Let's look at why drug prices are so high in the United States and whether we need drug prices to stay high to foster innovation. Let's look into why the prices seem to go up faster than inflation, whether the situation is actually better in the rest of the world, and how Trump could lower drug prices without price controls. Before we dig into that, let me tell you about this week's video sponsor, Delete Me. Delete Me is a subscription service that finds and removes any of your personal data that's been collected by data brokers and sold online. Data brokers are businesses that collect huge amounts of personally identifiable information on individuals and package it up to create profiles which can include things like social security numbers, birthdays, past and recent addresses, information about your family, and much more. This data can be used by identity thieves or online stalkers who want to harass or dox you. You're legally entitled to protect your privacy by requesting that data brokers delete the information they store on you. But unfortunately, there are hundreds of data brokers and they don't make it easy to get off their lists. It could take forever to do this on your own. I used Delete Me to reach out to the hundreds of data brokers on my behalf to request the deletion of my personal data and to deal with any objections. I got a full report back showing me where my data was removed from. With a yearly subscription, Delete Me keeps track of them to make sure that they don't re-add your data to their lists. Remove your personal information from the web using the link in the description and use code Boyle for 20% off. When President Trump first suggested that Canada could become the 51st American state last December, he had a surprising supporter, the Democratic Senator Bernie Sanders, who tweeted, "Does that mean that we can adopt the Canadian healthcare system and lower the cost of prescription drugs? I'm all for it." Sanders has been pushing for years for the US to adopt a Canadian-style healthcare system, including its price controls on prescription drugs. He even introduced a bill in 2017 to allow Americans to import medicines from Canadian pharmacies, as long as they meet certain safety standards. Sanders is not the only politician to have pitched this idea either. Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis spent years petitioning the federal government to allow his state to import drugs directly from Canada too. Last year, he succeeded, and Florida became the first U.S. state to launch a prescription drug importation program. Florida's program wouldn't directly help consumers at the pharmacy, as it instead aimed to lower cost for the state's Medicaid program and the medications provided by its corrections and health departments. The plan would only have a limited effect for Florida, as generic drugs are already 15 to 20% cheaper in the United States than in Canada, and these make up the majority of prescriptions. So it's just the brand name drugs that are cheaper in Canada, and this is because the Canadian government uses its buying power to negotiate lower prices with the pharmaceutical companies. One of the downsides of this approach is that if pharmaceutical companies don't agree to price cuts on their newest drugs, they're just unavailable in Canada. According to Forbes, Canadian patients only had access to 45% of the 460 new drugs introduced worldwide between 2012 and 2021, while American patients, if they could afford them, had access to 85% of them. Florida identified 14 drugs that it planned to import from Canada last year, but 1 year on, the results have been unspectacular. What do I mean by unspectacular? Well, what I mean is that it doesn't appear that Florida has imported a single Canadian drug so far. Importing medicines this way works out to be quite complicated because of the US FDA's requirements, which include finding companies to work with, like a Canadian exporter and a US importer, and then following a process to ensure that the drugs are safe and authentic. According to a lawsuit where the state of Florida is now suing the FDA, Florida has so far spent $50 million to set up a warehouse to store the medicines and paid an importer and distributor over $24 million, with this fee increasing at the rate of $1.2 million every month, even though not a single prescription pill has been imported, relabeled, or distributed. And this is because of the FDA's idleness, according to the lawsuit. One of the main reasons that prescription medicines are more expensive in America than elsewhere is that, like Canada, most other wealthy countries negotiate directly with pharmaceutical companies to get a good price on medications for the country as a whole. Because of the way that healthcare and health insurance works in the United States, thousands of smaller health plans negotiate their own prices, and because of their smaller sizes, these health plans can't buy the same volume as a country can, and thus they can't get the same kind of discounts. In the United States, the FDA decides if a new medicine is safe enough to be sold. And if it's safe, it can be sold. In places like the UK, the NHS additionally decides if it's worthwhile making the new medicine available. National health services in other countries often compare new medicines to existing ones to decide if the new one is actually better and if the improvements are worth the higher price. Pharmaceutical companies say that US patients get new medicines faster and with fewer insurance restrictions than patients in other countries. In 2016, there were protests in the United States over steep price hikes for EpiPens, which at $300 per dose cost more than 3 times what they cost in other developed nations. EpiPens are needed for people with extreme allergies who carry them around at all times in case of emergency. While these protests were going on in the United States, there were similar protests in the UK over the lack of access to a cystic fibrosis drug called Orkambi. In the US, Orkambi was available and cost around $270,000 per patient per year, a very expensive drug. The best price the NHS could negotiate with the manufacturer was about a 50% discount, but this was still too expensive for the NHS. According to The Guardian, Orkambi helps around 40% of patients with cystic fibrosis, but only has limited efficacy. Canada's cost-effectiveness body turned the drug down too. At the time that this was going on, President Trump accused the UK of freeloading by refusing to pay the high prices American drug companies charge for medications in the US. While new medicines do often become available in the United States earlier than in the rest of the world, research shows that Americans, and in particular uninsured Americans, skip taking their prescription medications due to cost more than citizens of any other developed country. There is a trade-off between price and availability. President Trump used the story of a very wealthy and overweight friend buying weight loss medication abroad to illustrate the problem that Americans face.
I'll tell you a story. A friend of mine who's a businessman, very, very, very top guy. Most of you would have heard of him. Very successful, very rich, seriously overweight, and he takes the fat shot drug. President, could I ask you a question? What? I'm in London, and I just paid for this damn fat drug I take. I said, it's not working. He said, I just paid $88, and in New York I pay $1,300. What the hell is going on? He said, so I checked, and it's the same box, made in the same plant, by the same company. It's the identical pill that I buy in New York. And here I'm paying $88 in London. In New York, I'm paying $1,300. Now, this is a great businessman, but he's not familiar with this crazy situation that we have. But he was stunned. I brought it up with the drug companies, represented by somebody who's very, very smart, good person too. And we argued about it for about half hour, and then finally he just said, because they can't justify it, he just said, look, you got me. You got me. I can no longer they've been justifying this crap for years. They said, oh, it's research and development. Well, I said, well, research and development, other countries should pay research and development too. It's for their benefit.
To understand drug testing, we need to go back to 1937, when an improperly prepared antibiotic caused a mass poisoning event in the United States, where over 100 people died. The public outcry led Congress to pass the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act a year later, which exempted drugs that people had been using for several years, like aspirin and insulin, but required pharmaceutical companies to provide convincing evidence to the FDA that any new product being introduced was safe for patients to consume as directed. After the thalidomide tragedy, a 1962 amendment was added, requiring drug makers to convince the agency that a new drug was effective as well as safe. The amount of time required to test new medications for safety and effectiveness has grown over time. And once again, there are trade-offs. No one wants unsafe medications being sold to the public, but equally, if testing takes too long, life-saving medications could be being withheld from the public, causing lives to be lost. In the 1980s, under intense pressure from advocates for AIDS patients who protested the agency's sluggishness, the FDA made changes in the way it tests and approves drugs for patients who are fatally ill. In 1983, the Orphan Drug Act was passed to encourage drug makers to develop rare disease treatments that otherwise might not be profitable to research. The FDA allowed approval for these drugs based on smaller trials with more flexible evidence standards, and it offered more time on the market for the medicines without generic competition, so that pharmaceutical manufacturers could earn a reasonable profit from their research. The Prescription Drug User Fee Act of 1993 allowed the FDA to start charging pharmaceutical companies fees to fund the review process. This additional funding sped up the approval process, but increased the cost of doing business for pharmaceutical companies. In 1993, the FDA collected $66 million in fees from the pharmaceutical industry, but were collecting more than 12 times as much by 2018. FDA drug review times declined from more than 3 years in 1983 to less than 1 year in 2017, but total time from the authorization of clinical testing to approval has remained constant at approximately 8 years over that period. While there are complaints about the speed of the drug approval process in the United States, research from the Yale School of Medicine found that the FDA moves faster than its counterparts in Europe, Canada, and Japan. One of the arguments that the pharmaceutical companies make for new drugs being so expensive in the United States is that R&D is both risky and expensive. Only about 12% of new molecules make it through the approval process to being commercialized, and a recent study found that R&D spending for the industry hit $276 billion in 2021. Last year, the FDA approved 50 new drugs for use in the United States. If we divide the $276 billion of annual R&D spending by 50 new drugs a year, we end up with $5.52 billion per drug in research cost alone. Drug companies need to make that back and cover the cost of manufacturing and marketing before they even break even. And not all of those 50 new drugs will be blockbusters either. Many will be competing with existing treatments, and some of the existing drugs will be better than the new ones. Once a new medication is approved, it has about 12 years of market dominance before a competitor brings out a similar or better drug. Pharmaceutical companies have to make their money back plus a profit in this 12-year window. Unlike the 20-year patents that drug makers get, which are generally acquired early in the development process and are based on intellectual property rights rather than evidence of safety and effectiveness, marketing exclusivity is granted only after a drug has been approved by the FDA and only when statutory requirements are met. Exclusivity puts into place a period of time during which no other applications can be accepted and or approved for the same active ingredient. This means that other manufacturers who want to develop alternative formulations or generic versions of the drug will not be able to have their products approved during that exclusivity period. There are exceptions to some of these protections too, which might even benefit President Trump's fat friend.
I'm not fat. I'm big-boned.
When drugs are in short supply like GLP-1, which is prescribed for diabetes as well as obesity, pharmacies in the United States are allowed to make compounded versions, which are full-blown copies so that people can still access important medications. The FDA declared a shortage of GLP-1 in 2022 due to high demand, allowing telehealth providers to make generic versions, and only recently removed it from the shortage list after the agency determined that the current supply of the drug can meet present and future demand. The compounded versions were very popular as cheaper alternatives for people whose insurance didn't cover the drug for weight loss, but now they're going away. CNBC reported last month that Novo Nordisk, the drug's manufacturer, will make the drug available at a discount through telehealth providers in order to address a larger market. Reuters reported last December that drug makers planned to raise prices in the US on at least 250 branded medications by approximately 4.5% for 2025. Their research shows that larger drug price increases were once far more common in the United States, but in recent years drug makers have scaled them back after price hikes drew sharp criticism in 2015. The issue of drug price hikes came into sharp focus in 2015 when Pharma bro and rap enthusiast Martin Shkreli bought an old drug called Daraprim, which treats life-threatening diseases in HIV patients. He raised the price overnight from $13.50 a pill to $750 a pill. The drug had been developed in the 1950s and had no patent protection, but there were no generic competitors available in the market that patients could turn to. He was the only supplier, and he marked the price up as much as he could. In principle, the new high price should encourage generic drug makers to produce a cheaper bioequivalent product. But because of the small number of patients who needed it and the short treatment duration relative to other drugs, it wasn't worthwhile for another company to start producing a generic version. A Reuters analysis in 2023 found that pharmaceutical companies launched new US drugs in that year at prices 35% higher than the prior year. They say that more than half of the new medicines were for orphan diseases, meaning diseases which affect fewer than 200,000 Americans, and that most of these drugs were not expected to become big sellers, possibly justifying the price per dose. Despite the constant political pressure to reduce the price of prescription medicines, Novartis introduced the world's most expensive medication in 2019, a gene-altering injection that cost $2.1 million for a one-time treatment for a rare inherited disease that destroys certain cells involved in muscle movement. If left untreated, patients typically don't live past childhood. Novartis offered insurers the choice of paying for the treatment in $425,000 installments over 5 years. The patent system was put in place to encourage innovation by giving inventors temporary monopolies on their new ideas so that they can recoup their R&D investment over time and hopefully yield a profit. If the business of coming up with new medicines is profitable, it should attract new market entrants, and society should broadly benefit from innovative new products. To patent a new product, an inventor has to fully disclose the details of their invention, giving the public complete possession of it. They then get a 20-year monopoly to commercialize their new idea without competition. When the patent expires, the invention falls into the public domain, and the inventor no longer has the exclusive right to commercialize their invention. In the United States, drug companies have been very successful at finding ways to extend that monopoly period through tactics like piling up patents to protect inventions that are only tangentially related to the drug in question. A 2023 paper from Cornell University found that the top 10 best-selling brand name pharmaceuticals have an average projected duration of 40.5 years of patent protection, which is more than double the 20-year statutory term. This practice of obtaining extended patent protection is known as evergreening. The authors of the paper say that the bulk of the patents contributing to evergreening are improvement patents that cover improvements to methods of using, manufacturing, or administering a drug. According to the New York Times, drug companies are not the only ones making money from high drug prices. Doctors, hospitals, and other intermediaries make more money when drug prices are high too. Under Medicare policies, for some drugs, doctors pay up front for the drugs that they administer to patients in their offices. They can then bill Medicare for the cost of the drug and get to charge a percentage of the drug cost, which is fixed by Medicare, to cover their overhead. If the doctor administers the cheapest available drug, they might only get to bill a few dollars for their work. So they're incentivized to administer the highest priced drug so that they can get paid a reasonable fee for their efforts. Experts also see misaligned incentives stemming from pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, which are big businesses that negotiate with pharmaceutical companies on behalf of the employers and health plans that pay most of the bills for prescription drugs. PBMs make more money when they negotiate a large discount with a pharmaceutical company. Because of this skewed incentive, the PBMs are accused of pushing pharmaceutical companies to increase the list prices of drugs, making pharmaceutical companies look bad and PBMs look good for negotiating huge discounts. A friend of mine who's worked as a pharma analyst for almost 20 years pointed out to me that if you look at the combined market caps of the PBMs and how they've grown over the last 15 years and compare that with the combined market caps of the big pharmaceutical companies, you'll quickly see where the taxpayer money is going. He explains that by law, PBMs are paid a cut of the difference between the list price and the negotiated price. If the list price is $100 and the negotiated price is $40, the PBM would get 10% of that $60 discount. The reason that PBMs saw their stock prices fall more than pharmaceutical stocks last week is that if Trump manages to bring the list prices down, it would hit the profitability of the PBMs more than the pharmaceutical companies. In the United States, my friend explained that Medicaid and Veteran Affairs are 100% centrally managed, whereas Medicare is partially managed by the US government and partially by PBMs. He explained that by law for Medicaid, drug companies must provide the greater of a fixed rebate of 23.1% versus the average manufacturing price, or the difference between the average manufacturing price and the lowest price the manufacturer offers to any private purchaser. This means that Medicaid prices are already extremely low, very close to European prices, if not lower, especially because there's also a CPI penalty, which means that if the list price has gone up by more than the rate of inflation, then the pharmaceutical company has to pay a penalty and pay back the difference, even if the pharmaceutical company was never paid the list price by Medicaid. My friend points out that this mechanism caused the price of insulin to go negative a decade ago, and that Sanofi was selling Lantus to Medicaid but had to deliver the drug for free and pay Medicaid money because they were asked by PBMs to increase the list price dramatically over the years so that PBMs could earn higher profits year after year. He points out that in Europe, around 10% of GDP is spent on healthcare versus 18% in the United States. But in both the US and Europe, drugs only account for 10 to 12% of overall healthcare costs, the biggest expense being physicians, hospitals, and so on. So the prices of prescription medications in the US are roughly in line with the overall cost of treating patients in the US. The second part of Trump's order, which directed RFK Jr. to establish a mechanism through which Americans can buy medicines directly from pharmaceutical companies, is worth discussing too. The question we have to ask is whether drug companies would want to sell directly to the public or not, verifying their prescriptions and so on like pharmacies do. Anyone who's ever gone directly to a manufacturer's website hoping to get a better price than they can get on Amazon or Walmart probably knows how this might work out. The pharmaceutical companies may not want to compete with their distributors. Some of the big pharma companies already have direct-to-customer sales channels like Lilly Direct and NovaCare, but we'll have to wait and see if they'll start undercutting the big chain drugstore prices. Analysts so far are saying that the lack of specific information in Trump's executive order makes it hard to predict its eventual impact, and they say that the order is more of a statement of intent, but that it has no legislative authority. The Democratic representative Ro Khanna quickly introduced a bill to codify the executive order in Congress, which, if passed, would give Trump's most favored nation pricing the force of law. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders released a statement agreeing with Trump, saying if Trump is serious about making real change rather than just issuing a press release, he will support the legislation I'll soon be introducing to make sure we pay no more for prescription drugs than people in other major countries. Researchers at the University of Southern California told the BBC that the executive order could possibly backfire if drug companies decided to pull out of selling new medications in poor countries to try to retain their profits in the US. It's also not clear how lower prescription drug prices fit into RFK Jr.'s Make America Healthy Again agenda, as he's been critical of the widespread use of pharmaceutical products, including vaccines, instead emphasizing diet, exercise, and possibly testosterone replacement therapy as the key to improving Americans' health. Conor O'Keefe at the Mises Institute argues that if the Trump administration wants to solve the issue of high drug prices without disastrous price controls causing drug shortages, there are several things they can do. The first is allowing Americans to buy drugs from foreign markets. The only reason that companies can charge two different prices for the same product in different countries is that the government prohibits Americans from buying and importing that product from abroad. Another approach would be to reduce the number of years of patent protection on new drugs, meaning that generics become available more quickly, or Trump could reduce the cost of getting FDA approval for new drugs with expedited testing, reducing development costs. All of these solutions are trade-offs with pros and cons. There's no perfect solution, and there are no easy answers. If it was as easy as demanding that prices should be lower, the problem would have been solved a long time ago. If you found this video interesting, you should watch this one next. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Delete Me, using the link in the video description. Have a great day and talk to you in the next video. Bye.